The afternoon light over southern Tennessee was calm and steady, the kind of light that turns dry grass into a soft gold and makes every board on an old porch look warm. Evelyn sat on that porch with a shoebox in her lap. The box did not weigh much, yet it felt heavy in the quiet of that day. The wind moved across the fields and pressed against the house with a slow breath. Somewhere, a screen door creaked and shut in the distance, and the sound faded like an old memory that would not leave. The house had stood there for a long time. It knew more stories than any person living in the valley. Evelyn placed the box on her knees and lifted the lid with care, as if she were opening a door that led back through years she had tried to keep closed. Inside were photographs wrapped in brittle paper, programs from church services, and a faded ribbon from a county fair long past. The ribbon made her think of Richard and the way he liked to keep small proof of simple days. She set the ribbon aside and began to sort the photographs into small piles. Weddings, harvest suppers, a front yard dusted with winter frost, hands rough from work resting on a fence that needed new paint. Each image held a sound and a smell and a time already gone. She looked at them one by one with a steady face, but a soft ache grew in her chest, the kind that comes when love is not in the room anymore and the world feels too wide. She found the photograph near the bottom of the box. It was larger than the others and printed on thick paper that had kept its shape through damp summers and long cold spells. The edges were clean, the surface was flat. The colors had faded into a gentle brown that softened every line. It showed the farmhouse when the paint was new and the roof was straight. Two figures stood in front of the steps with the sun behind them so that their shadows reached toward the road. Evelyn recognized herself at once, younger and hopeful, her dress plain and neat. Beside her stood Richard. He faced the camera with the quiet pride of a man who believed that work and time could fix almost anything. Evelyn held the photograph closer to the light. In the second-floor window, there was something that did not belong. At first, it looked like a trick of the glass or a blur from the camera lens. She moved the picture left and right, and the shape held. It was a figure. It was the upright form of a man inside the house, well behind the window, not near the porch where she and Richard had stood. The figure faced the camera. The features were faint, but not broken by glare. Shoulders, collar, the top line of a jaw, eyes fixed on the yard as if he knew he would be seen by whoever kept this image safe. She lowered the photograph and studied the window of the actual house. The light in the glass was pale. The curtains did not move. The wind pressed softly at the corners. No one stood there now. Still, her hands felt cool, and her breath came deeper. She had lived on this land for years. She knew the sounds it made, the way the old beams settled, the small knocks and groans that came with heat and cold. She also knew this image was not a sound and not a draft. It was a record caught on paper when the day had been normal and kind. She placed the photograph on the table beside her and pressed her palms against her knees until they stopped shaking. The porch boards held her weight and did not complain. She listened to the afternoon around her. A crow moved its voice through the air and then grew quiet. A far road carried a single truck toward town. The world kept its slow order. She told herself to be steady and to move through steps that made sense. She would search the rest of the box. She would look for dates. She would note where each photo was taken and how the light fell inside each frame. She would keep to facts as if she were sewing a straight seam. There were more photographs of the house. Some were taken in spring when the front steps wore a line of muddy prints left by boots. Some were taken in winter when breath showed in the air and the sun hung low like a coin too tired to rise. In 3 of those images, a figure appeared again where no person should have been. In one, the shape stood near the top of the stairs behind the glass. In another, it was set back in the hallway where the light thinned and the wallpaper looked like pressed leaves. In the last one, the figure stood by the barn door so far in the background that the head was almost level with the roof line. The face was never clear. The posture was always the same, patient, watchful, not a threat, not a friend, not yet. Evelyn gathered the 3 photos and laid them side by side with the first one. The 4 together made a quiet pattern that she could not set aside. She closed the box and brought the images inside. The kitchen held the smell of coffee and wood polish. The radio on the counter was silent. A simple clock marked the minutes with a sound that comforted her. She placed the photographs on the table in a row and sat with a pencil and a small notebook. She wrote down what she knew, the dates written on the back, the time of year, the angle of the sun, the parts of the house that had changed, and the parts that had not moved since the day the first plank was nailed. When the light began to fade, she went upstairs to the room that matched the window in the photographs. The boards creaked in the quiet way they had always creaked. The smell there was dry and clean, a mixture of old pine and air that did not move much. The window glass held a dull shine and showed the fields in a soft blur. She placed her hand on the sill and felt the faint roughness where paint had been set down by steady hands long ago. On the wall, a small nail stuck out at an angle. The nail held no frame and no coat. It held only time. She stood still until her breath found a slow pace again. Then she returned to the kitchen and turned on the lamp that kept the room warm, even when the evening tried to cool it. She did not speak to herself. She did not wish or fear out loud. She moved with care, as if the air might hold an answer if she did not disturb it. She opened the old drawer where Richard had kept receipts and bits of hardware and a stack of church bulletins. Between two folded papers, she found a clipping from a local newspaper printed in small type. A red pencil had underlined a name that she did not know. The column said that a man had gone missing in a summer long past near a farm with a barn that needed repair. The note did not accuse. It did not tell a full story. It simply named a place and a person, and a question that had never been settled. The initials of that man matched the faint letters she had seen once on a metal item found years ago when the barn floor had been disturbed for a repair. Evelyn made tea and sat again at the table. She held the warm mug and looked at the photographs. The figure seemed less like a trick and more like a quiet request. The house did not feel angry. It did not feel sick. It felt like land that had held on to a task because no one else had claimed it. She thought about the way faith meets the ordinary world. Faith does not erase the weight of wood and stone. Faith teaches a person to carry it with purpose. She decided that she would go to the small library in town the next day. She would ask for records. She would look for any sign that joined the name in the clipping to the land beneath her feet. Night moved over the fields with gentle steps. She turned off the radio even though it had not been on. She checked the back door and the side door. The locks were firm. The porch light made a small circle on the boards, and a moth hit the glass once and then moved away. She brought the photographs to the bedroom and set them on the dresser, where the light of the lamp was soft and warm. She lay down and closed her eyes, but sleep stayed out of reach. Behind her eyelids, she saw the second-floor window of the house, as it had been in the picture. She saw the figure at rest behind the glass, not moving, not knocking, holding his place like a page marker in a very old book. Near midnight, a breeze touched the house, and the upstairs window clicked in its frame. The sound was small and clean. She opened her eyes and listened to the silence that followed. The clock in the kitchen kept its count. The house returned to stillness. She sat up and reached for the photograph on the dresser. The paper felt cool and smooth. She turned it over and looked for any note. The back was plain. There was no writing. There was only the soft wear of fingers from years of careful handling. She set it down and folded her hands and waited for her breath to slow. Morning came with a pale sky and a thin veil of fog that hugged the low places in the field. Evelyn washed her face in cool water and tied her hair back. She ate a simple breakfast and put the photographs in a large envelope so they would not bend. She drove into town on the road that ran straight past fence lines and hedges and small ponds that held the sky like a second world. At the library, the bell above the door made a gentle ring. The room smelled of paper and soap and quiet effort. The librarian knew her by name and showed her how to reach the shelf that held county histories and property maps. She traced names with her finger. Families came and went. Farms changed hands after hard winters and long droughts. The Whitaker name appeared many times on the old ledger pages, and on one page a note had been added in small, neat script that said a worker had left one day and had not returned to collect his wages. There was no accusation in the line. There was only a space where a person should have been. She copied the page number and the date and thanked the librarian for her help. As she walked out, she felt the light on her face and the cool air from the door mix into something that gave her courage. Back at the farmhouse, she placed the envelope on the kitchen table and stood at the sink for a moment, with her hands on the edge. She looked out at the yard, where the grass sloped down toward the barn. The barn looked tired but honest, the way old buildings do when they have seen storms and held their ground without complaint. She knew that the truth would not hide in a loud place. It would wait in quiet corners and call to patient hands. She gathered a small hand shovel and a brush. She walked to the barn and opened the door with a slow pull so the hinges would not cry out. Dust rose in a thin cloud and settled again. Sun came in through a gap in the boards and drew a bright stripe on the floor. She stood still until her eyes matched the light. At the far wall, the ground had a place where the dirt looked less firm. She knelt and brushed the surface away with careful strokes. The earth gave up a small piece of metal that might once have been smooth and bright. The edge showed the faint line of an inscription worn down by time and soil. She held it and felt the way old metal keeps a kind of chill no matter how long it rests in a warm hand. She set it on a clean cloth and continued to brush, feeling each inch as if the ground were a page and she were reading a slow sentence, word by word. When the sun moved and the light stripe crossed the floor, she stopped and sat back on her heels. The barn smelled like hay and dry wood and a hint of rain from days past. She thought of the figure in the photograph. She pictured him not as a threat, but as a witness who had waited too long. She stood and carried the cloth back to the house. She washed the metal piece in a bowl and dried it with a linen towel. The letters were still hard to read, but a shape near the edge looked like the start of an H. She noted it in her book and drew a small sketch with the date and the place found. She closed the book and kept it near the photographs so that nothing would be lost. Twilight laid a soft blue over the fields. The house took in the light and gave it back in warm squares on the yard. Evelyn sat by the window and watched the first star appear above the far tree line. She felt the ache of absence and the strength that absence can make when a person chooses to stand and work and keep faith. She did not know yet why the figure had found a way into the background of a happy day, but she knew that a reason existed, and that reason would meet her if she met it with care. The night gathered gently. She rose and lit a candle on the kitchen table. The flame held steady. The room felt whole. She whispered a quiet promise that she would carry this to its end with patience and honor. The house rested with her, and the land kept its watch. The morning that followed brought a soft rain. It fell with a quiet rhythm, steady and patient, washing the dust from the porch and drawing thin streams down the windows. Evelyn stood by the sink with a cup of coffee in her hand. The smell of wet earth drifted through the small gap near the door. The envelope from the library rested on the table, and inside were the copies she had made from the old county records. The name Henry Cole appeared again and again in the handwriting of men who were long gone. Each line felt like a whisper from the past, as if the land itself had been trying to remind someone that it remembered. She finished her coffee and walked to the barn once more. The rain had turned the ground dark and rich, and the boards of the barn glistened faintly under the grey sky. She opened the door slowly and stepped inside. The same quiet smell of dry wood and thyme greeted her. She walked to the spot where she had dug the day before and knelt. Her small shovel rested nearby, and the dirt was soft from the moisture that had seeped in overnight. She began to dig again, not with haste but with careful rhythm, as if each motion might disturb a story that had been buried too long. Her fingers met something solid again. She brushed away the earth and found a small wooden box. Its surface darkened by age and water. The hinges had rusted, but the shape was still firm. She lifted it carefully and placed it on her lap. For a long moment, she only looked at it, her breath quiet, her heart steady. Then she opened the lid. Inside lay a small stack of folded papers, a ribbon faded to grey, and a photograph. The photograph showed a man standing by a fence, the fields behind him wide and empty. He was young, his hair neatly combed, his eyes serious but kind. On the back, written in delicate script, were the words, "For Margaret, "I will return." Evelyn turned the paper over again and studied his face. The same jawline, the same shape of the eyes. She had seen this face before, not in her memory, but in the shadow that stood behind the window in her own photograph. She sat there in the still barn, listening to the rain tapping gently against the roof. The sound was steady and low, almost like breathing. She did not feel fear now, only understanding. Whoever this man had been, he had tried to keep a promise. Something had stopped him, and somehow his story had remained tied to this place. She folded the papers, closed the box, and carried it back to the house. The rest of the morning passed in quiet work. She dried the wooden box, laid the papers flat, and spread them across the kitchen table. The ink was faded, but she could still read the words. The letters were written to Margaret, each one signed by Henry Cole. They spoke of plans to marry in the spring, of a small plot of land near the hills, and of dreams of a family. The last letter ended abruptly with the line, "If something keeps me away, know that I am near." Evelyn ran her fingers over the words. The edges of the paper felt fragile but alive. In the afternoon, the rain stopped. The air outside smelled clean and new. She stepped onto the porch and looked across the fields. The horizon was bright again, washed in silver light. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called. The land seemed softer, less burdened. She thought about Margaret Whittaker, the woman whose name appeared in the records, a widow long before her time, a woman who had waited for someone who never returned. Evelyn felt a quiet kinship with her. They had both known what it was like to live with absence, to hold on to love through silence. Later that day, Evelyn drove to the church. The small white building stood near the crossroads, its bell tower rising modestly against the sky. Pastor Lewis was there, sweeping rainwater from the steps. He smiled when he saw her and motioned her inside. The church smelled of wax and old wood. She sat down in the front pew while the pastor listened to her story. She told him about the photograph, the box, the letters, and the man who had disappeared almost a century ago. When she finished, Pastor Lewis nodded slowly. "There are some places," he said, "where time does not forget. Sometimes God lets the truth rest until a heart strong enough comes along to uncover it." He offered to visit her farm the next morning to pray over the land. Evelyn agreed, grateful for the comfort his words brought. That night, she could not sleep. The moon was bright outside, casting silver light through the curtains. She sat up in bed and looked at the photograph again. The face in the background was still there, but now it seemed softer, almost peaceful. She turned it over and saw something she had not noticed before. Near the bottom corner, scratched faintly into the paper, were two more letters, M.W. She whispered the names to herself, Henry Cole and Margaret Whittaker, two people whose lives had crossed paths with hers through paper, shadow, and time. She thought about how many lives might be connected this way, each story waiting quietly to be seen. The next morning, Pastor Lewis arrived early. The sunlight was golden again, warm and clean after the storm. They walked together to the back of the property where the old well stood. The stones were covered with moss, and the boards over the top were damp from rain. The pastor rested his hand on the wood and bowed his head. He prayed for peace, for the land, for the souls that lingered, and for Evelyn. His voice was calm, like water running over stone. When he finished, they stood in silence for a long time, listening to the gentle hum of the wind. After the pastor left, Evelyn stayed near the well. She traced her fingers along the stones and thought about what might lie beneath. She did not feel drawn to dig. She believed that what needed to be found had already been found. What remained was not buried in the earth anymore, but carried in her heart. The days that followed passed in soft rhythm. The air grew warmer. The fields began to show the first hints of green. Evelyn spent her mornings reading on the porch and her afternoons tending to the flowers that lined the yard. The house no longer felt heavy. Each room carried its own small light. Sometimes, when she passed by the staircase, she thought she saw a flicker of movement upstairs, a soft shift of shadow where none should be. She would pause smile faintly, and keep walking. One evening, she stood at the window watching the sunset. The sky burned in colors of gold and rose, and the land stretched endlessly toward the horizon. She thought about Richard, about Margaret and Henry, and about how each of them had found a way to leave something behind that lasted longer than loss. The wind moved through the trees with a sound like a sigh, neither sad nor joyful, just alive. That night, she wrote in her notebook. She wrote about what she had seen, what she had learned, and what she now understood. She wrote that sometimes love is not something that ends, but something that changes its shape until it can be carried in silence. She closed the notebook, placed it beside the old wooden box, and blew out the lamp. The house settled into quiet. The air held the warmth of the day. Outside, the moon rose again over the Tennessee hills. Evelyn lay awake for a while, listening to the gentle breath of the night. In her heart, she felt the peace that comes when the unknown is no longer frightening, but sacred. She knew the land was resting now, and she was resting with it. Before closing her eyes, she whispered a prayer of thanks for Richard, for Henry, for Margaret, and for the strange way that truth can find its way home through hands willing to uncover it. Where in the world are you watching from? Leave it down below in the comments. The following morning came with clear skies and a light wind that carried the smell of pine from the woods beyond the fields. The air was crisp and fresh, and sunlight touched the land with a quiet gold that made everything seem clean again. Evelyn stood on her porch with her hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee. She watched the trees sway in the distance and thought about the prayer Pastor Lewis had said the day before. The words had stayed in her mind all night, echoing softly between her thoughts. She had not seen the figure again, not in dreams and not in the glass, but she still felt that presence, calm, grateful, almost at peace. After breakfast, she decided to visit the town cemetery. The road was smooth and lined with old oaks, whose branches formed gentle arches overhead. When she reached the small white church at the edge of town, she parked near the gate and walked through the rows of graves. The grass was still damp from dew, and the air was filled with the faint sound of birds. She moved slowly, reading names carved into stone, some clear, some nearly erased by time. Then she saw it, a small marker near the back, half covered by ivy. The name read Margaret Whittaker, and below it the words, "Faithful in waiting." Evelyn knelt beside the grave and brushed away the vines. The letters were worn, but still legible. She thought of the locket, the letters, and the man whose photograph she had found in the box. "You waited for him," she whispered, her voice steady. "He found his way home." She placed a small white flower she had picked from the roadside beside the stone. For a long time, she stayed there in silence, the wind moving softly through her hair. When she returned to the farmhouse that afternoon, the house greeted her with its familiar warmth. The smell of cedar lingered from the furniture polish she had used the day before. She set her bag on the table and looked around the kitchen. The box of letters still lay there, neat and dry, as if they had never been buried beneath the soil. She opened the lid once more and read a few lines from Henry's final letter. The ink was faint, but strong enough to be seen. "If something keeps me away, know that I am near." That night, Evelyn dreamed again. She was standing by the barn, the same barn that had kept its secrets beneath the earth. In her dream, the field was bathed in silver light, and the air was calm. A man stood near the well, his form clear now, no longer distant or hidden by shadow. He looked at her with gentle eyes and nodded once, as if in gratitude. She tried to speak, but no sound came. Instead, the wind moved between them, carrying a sense of peace so deep it reached through her chest. When she woke, her pillow was damp with tears, not from fear, but from something softer, understanding. The next morning she felt lighter. She made breakfast and opened all the windows to let the fresh air in. The curtains moved with the breeze, and sunlight played across the floor. It was as if the house itself had begun to breathe again. Later, she decided to visit the attic once more. She climbed the narrow stairs with slow steps, the wooden boards creaking gently under her feet. The air up there smelled of dust and old wood, but it no longer carried the heavy stillness that once made her uneasy. She opened the small window to let in the light. As she moved a stack of boxes aside, she found something she had not noticed before. It was a small trunk, tucked behind an old rocking chair. The lock had rusted away, and the lid lifted easily. Inside were a few folded blankets, a small Bible, and a collection of letters bound with twine. The handwriting on the envelopes was delicate, with the same initials she had seen before, M.W. These were Margaret's letters. Evelyn sat on the floor and began to read. The letters spoke of everyday life, the farm, the weather, the harvest, but also of hope. Margaret had written about waiting for Henry, about believing he would return no matter how long it took. The last letter was shorter than the rest. If love is true, it never loses its way. I will wait until the fields grow quiet and the sky forgets the storms. Evelyn closed the envelope carefully and placed it back in the trunk. She felt an ache of admiration for a woman who had carried so much faith through years of silence. Later that day, she drove back to town and stopped by the Historical Society. The clerk, an elderly woman named Dorothy, recognized her at once. Evelyn explained what she had found and showed her copies of the letters. Dorothy adjusted her glasses and smiled faintly. I remember hearing about the Whitakers when I was a child, she said. People said Mrs. Whitaker kept a candle burning in her window every night until she passed. Some thought she did it for her husband, but maybe it was for Henry. I suppose now we'll never know. Evelyn thanked her, and before leaving, Dorothy handed her a thin ledger from 1934. Inside, among the long lists of local news, was a small paragraph that caught her eye. Unidentified remains found near the Whitaker property, believed to be those of missing worker Henry Cole, laid to rest at the family cemetery. Evelyn felt her breath catch. There was no record of a service, no marker, nothing else. The story had been forgotten, folded into the soil and left behind. She copied the note and returned home before dusk. The sky was clear, and the fields shimmered under the fading light. She parked near the gate and stood for a while, looking out across the land that had held so many secrets. That night, she took a shovel and walked to the back of the property near the barn. She did not dig deep, only enough to clear the spot beside the flowers she had planted near the well. She placed a small wooden cross there and carved into it with her knife the letters H.C. She stood back, her hands trembling slightly, and whispered, "You can rest now." The wind moved through the grass in a soft wave, carrying the faint scent of lilies. Afterward, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, her body tired but her mind at peace. The candle on the table flickered gently, its flame reflected in the glass of the window beside her. For a brief moment, she saw not her own reflection, but the faint outline of two figures standing together inside the house. A man and a woman, their forms soft in the golden light. They did not move, and she did not look away. She simply smiled. In the days that followed, Evelyn continued her quiet life. She kept tending to the garden, feeding the stray cat that had begun to visit her porch, and writing in her notebook each evening. The photograph that had started everything still sat on the dresser, but the image had changed. The shadow behind the window was gone. Only the clear shapes of herself and Richard remained. One afternoon, Pastor Lewis returned for a visit. He brought her a loaf of bread from his wife and a small wooden cross he had carved himself. They sat on the porch together, speaking softly as the day warmed. When Evelyn told him what she had done, he smiled and nodded. "Peace has a way of finding the places that welcome it," he said. "I believe your home was waiting for that peace for a long time." She looked out across the field, where the flowers now bloomed in bright color. "Maybe that's true," she said. "Maybe that's what love does when we let it." As the sun lowered and the sky turned orange, Pastor Lewis stood to leave. He placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You've given more than peace to this land, Evelyn. You've given it memory again." Then he drove away down the long dirt road, the sound of his truck fading into the soft hum of evening. That night, Evelyn wrote one final note in her journal. She wrote about truth and how it waits for someone brave enough to bring it into the light. She wrote about loss and how it can teach a person not just sorrow, but purpose. And she wrote about love, how it moves quietly through the world, finding its way through time and earth and faith until it returns home. The moon rose high over the fields, and the light of her candle burned steady in the window. She watched it for a while before going to bed. The house was silent, but not empty. It was alive, full of quiet echoes of grace. The story that had begun with a photograph had now found its peace, and Evelyn knew she would carry it with her for the rest of her days. The first days of April arrived with a softness that felt almost unreal. The Tennessee hills were painted in green again, and the trees stretched their branches toward the warm air as if greeting an old friend. After months of grey skies and heavy thoughts, Evelyn began to feel life returning to the land, and with it, to her heart. Each morning she woke earlier, drawn by the light that crept through the curtains and the song of birds that seemed to echo through every open field. She no longer felt the weight of that long silence that once filled her house. Now there was something lighter in the air, something that whispered renewal. Her days followed a quiet rhythm. She would begin by tending to the flowers she had planted near the well, watering the lilies and daisies that had begun to bloom in small bursts of white and yellow. She often paused to look across the open field, the sunlight spreading in a soft golden wave, touching every blade of grass. The air carried the scent of earth and rain, and something else she could not name. Maybe forgiveness, maybe peace. She still thought of Henry and Margaret sometimes, but the thought no longer hurt. It was like remembering a hymn you once sang as a child, the melody still familiar even after years of silence. One morning, Evelyn received a letter in the mail. The envelope was thick and sealed carefully with a blue stamp. It came from the county historical office. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper typed neatly, confirming that a small gravestone had been added to the old Whitaker plot under her request, marking the resting place of Henry Cole. It read simply, "Beloved in silence, remembered in peace." Evelyn sat at the table for a long time after reading those words. She placed the letter beside her Bible and bowed her head. That afternoon, she drove into town to buy a few candles from the small store near the church. The shop smelled of cinnamon and wood polish, and the woman behind the counter greeted her kindly. When Evelyn mentioned the grave, the woman nodded. "I know that place," she said. "My grandmother used to tell stories about that farm. She said it was a house that loved deeply, but it carried its love like a burden until someone came along to set it free." Evelyn smiled softly. "Maybe that's true," she said. "Maybe all houses hold the hearts of those who built them." When she returned home, she placed one of the candles on the windowsill and lit it. The small flame flickered gently against the glass. The house glowed with a warmth that made it feel alive again. She sat in her chair near the window and began to write. The words came easily, flowing from her mind, as if they had been waiting for the right time to appear. She wrote about love that survives through silence, about promises that outlive the people who make them, and about the quiet strength that comes from forgiveness. She did not know if anyone would ever read her words, but that did not matter. The act of writing itself felt like prayer. Days passed peacefully, each one carrying a little more light than the last. Pastor Lewis visited her on Sunday afternoons after service. He often brought her fresh bread or jars of jam made by his wife. They sat on the porch and talked about simple things: the weather, the crops, the sound of the river in spring. Sometimes they spoke about faith, about how some wounds are not meant to be erased, but transformed into lessons that guide us forward. Evelyn listened with calm eyes, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I think God gives us stories," she said one afternoon, "not because he wants us to suffer through them, but because he wants us to see what grows after the pain." The pastor nodded slowly. "That may be the purest form of faith there is," he said. When evening came, Evelyn walked through her house with the steady step of someone who finally belonged where she was. The walls no longer carried the echoes of loneliness. Instead, they held memories that had found peace. The photograph on the dresser had faded a little more, the colors softening into shades of sepia. Only the shape of the house and the faces of her and Richard remained clear. The window in the background now looked like a mirror, reflecting only the sky. She smiled, touched the edge of the frame, and whispered, "Thank you." One night, she dreamed of the house as it had been when she and Richard first arrived. The paint was new, the garden still bare. In the dream she walked through the rooms, each one filled with light. She saw Margaret standing near the window, her dress swaying gently, as if moved by a soft wind. Henry stood beside her, holding her hand. They both turned to Evelyn, smiling with quiet gratitude. No words were spoken, but she understood. When she woke, the dawn light was streaming through the curtains, warm and golden, and the house seemed to hum with life. That day she decided to fix the old fence that bordered the east field. The boards were loose and splintered from years of wind and rain. She gathered her tools and began working under the bright sun. The sound of hammering carried across the yard, mixing with the distant hum of bees. Each strike of the nail felt like a heartbeat, steady and sure. As she worked, she remembered Richard teaching her how to mend things, how to sand a board, how to paint, how to care for what you build. "Everything worth keeping needs hands that care for it," he used to say. She smiled at the memory and wiped her brow with the back of her hand. By evening, the fence stood straight again. The field stretched endlessly beyond it, calm and gold under the setting sun. Evelyn leaned against the fence post and looked toward the horizon. The sky was painted in deep colors of orange and violet. A flock of birds crossed in quiet formation, their wings glinting in the fading light. For the first time in years, she felt whole. That night, she sat on the porch with her candle burning beside her. The stars appeared one by one, bright against the dark sky. She thought about the people who had walked this land before her: Henry, Margaret, Richard, and all the others whose names had faded with time. She realized that life was not about holding on to the past, but about carrying forward the light it leaves behind. She whispered softly, "We are all just passing through, leaving stories behind for someone else to find." The wind moved through the trees, soft and steady, and for a brief moment she thought she heard the faint sound of footsteps on the porch behind her. She turned, but no one was there. Only the candle flame flickered, and the air smelled faintly of lilac. She smiled again, certain of what she felt. As the days turned into weeks, Evelyn began to visit the small cemetery more often. She tended to both graves, Henry's and Margaret's, trimming the grass and leaving fresh flowers whenever she could. The caretaker eventually told her, "No one's ever looked after those plots before. You've given them a home again." She simply nodded and said it was time. One Sunday morning after service, Pastor Lewis asked her if she would be willing to share her story with the congregation. He believed that her experience could help others understand faith in a new way. Evelyn thought for a moment, then agreed. The following week, she stood at the front of the small church, her voice steady and calm. She did not speak of ghosts or mysteries. She spoke of love, of loss, of promises that never fade, and of how forgiveness can heal even the quietest wounds. The congregation listened in silence, many with tears in their eyes. When she finished, the pastor took her hand and said, "You've given this community a story of hope." After that day, people in town often stopped her on the street or after church to thank her. Some brought flowers for her garden, others left small notes on her porch. They said her story reminded them that faith is not always found in miracles, but in the courage to keep believing when the world grows quiet. As summer returned, the farmhouse stood bright and alive once more. The fields waved with tall grass, and the air shimmered with light. Evelyn spent her mornings writing by the window, her pen moving steadily across the page. She wrote not about sorrow, but about gratitude. She wrote that peace does not come from forgetting, but from remembering with kindness. She wrote that every act of love, no matter how small, leaves a mark that time cannot erase. When evening came, she would light her candle again, the same small flame that had once been a symbol of loss, now burning as a symbol of faith. She would sit in her chair, listening to the crickets in the distance, and watch the fields fade into dusk. The past no longer frightened her. It had become a companion, a quiet presence that reminded her that every ending can hold the seed of something new. And as she looked out across the land, she knew the story was no longer about what had been found in a photograph. It was about what had been restored in a heart that had learned to see light again after so many years of shadow. The summer days grew long. long, and the light lingered over the Tennessee fields until late in the evening. The air shimmered with warmth, and the wind carried the hum of cicadas and the smell of ripe hay. Evelyn had fallen into a gentle rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Each morning she rose before sunrise, walked barefoot across the porch, and watched the mist drift low over the valley. The house behind her, once a shell of memory and sorrow, now pulsed with quiet life. Inside, every room carried signs of renewal. The kitchen smelled of herbs drying on the counter. The curtains were freshly washed, the wood floors polished to a soft shine. The candle she lit each night by the window had burned so often that the glass bowl beneath it held layers of melted wax, each one marking a day of peace restored. She kept the old photograph near it, the one that had started everything. The paper had grown thin from handling, the edges curled from heat, but she could not bring herself to hide it away. It was no longer a symbol of fear or confusion. It was proof that truth, no matter how long buried, finds its way to the surface. As the weeks passed, people from town began to visit more often. Neighbors stopped by with baskets of peaches, jars of honey, or simple greetings that turned into long conversations on the porch. One morning, Martha brought her granddaughter, a curious little girl with wide eyes. The child pointed to the fields and asked Evelyn if she had always lived there. Evelyn smiled and said, "Not always, but long enough to understand what this land teaches." The girl tilted her head and asked, "What does it teach?" Evelyn thought for a moment, then said, "That everything lost can be found again, just not always in the way we expect." Later that afternoon, when they had gone, she sat on the porch with a cool glass of lemonade and watched the clouds drift slowly across the sky. She thought about what she had said and realized it was true. The land had taught her that peace is not something that arrives all at once. It is built in quiet hours, in the steady work of mending fences, planting flowers, and forgiving what time has taken. In early August, a small package arrived in the mail. The handwriting on the label was neat and unfamiliar. Inside, she found a thin book bound in brown leather. A note rested on the first page. "Dear Mrs. Whitaker," it began, "we recently catalogued a set of diaries donated to the county archive. Among them was this small journal belonging to your property's first owners. We thought you might wish to have it returned." The note was signed by Dorothy, the clerk from the Historical Society. Evelyn turned the pages carefully. The handwriting inside was delicate and slanted. The journal belonged to Margaret. The entries were short, often only a few sentences, but each one carried a quiet intimacy. "The rain came today. Henry says the crops will grow strong. I made soup for the neighbors and lit a candle for his journey tomorrow." Later, pages grew sparse, the handwriting shaky. "It has been 6 weeks since Henry left. I still light the candle." Then near the end, a final entry. "If love travels beyond sight, then he will find me. I will wait where the light meets the window." Evelyn closed the journal slowly and set it beside her own notebook. The weight of both felt the same. Two lives separated by time, but joined by faith and the patience to wait for what is right. She decided to place the journal beside the photograph on the shelf above the mantel. Together, they told a story of endurance, of hearts that had lived through storms and still believed in the calm that followed. That night, she dreamt again. The dream was vivid but soft, like a film projected through golden light. She stood at the window of her house, looking out over the fields under a sky filled with silver stars. In the distance, near the old well, she saw two figures walking hand in hand. They moved slowly, with ease, and as they passed beneath the moonlight, Evelyn recognized them. Henry and Margaret. They turned once, smiling toward her, and then continued walking until they vanished into the horizon, leaving the land bathed in quiet peace. When she woke, her face was wet with tears, but her heart felt light. The next day, she decided to drive to the cemetery one last time that summer. She brought a small bouquet of wildflowers and the same candle she had lit every night. When she arrived, the sun was low, painting the sky in colors of amber and rose. She placed the flowers on both graves and set the candle between them. As she lit it, a gentle wind passed through the trees, bending the tall grass and carrying the flames sent through through the air. Evelyn whispered, "You kept your promise and I kept mine." The candle's flame danced but did not go out. She stayed there until the first stars appeared, then walked back slowly to her car. Back at home, the night was warm. She sat by the window with her Bible open and the old photograph beside her. The reflection of the candlelight glowed softly on the glass. She noticed something she had never seen before. In the photograph, behind her and Richard, the faint outline of the farmhouse window shimmered differently in the light. It no longer looked empty. Instead, it caught the glow of something unseen, like sunlight reflected from another day. She traced the image with her finger and smiled. The following weeks brought more visitors. Pastor Lewis came often, not as a counselor anymore, but as a friend. They shared meals, laughter, and long talks about faith and time. One evening, as they watched the sunset from her porch, the pastor said, "I believe you've turned this house into something holy, Evelyn. It was built for work and family, but you've given it spirit." She laughed softly. "I don't think I gave it anything," she said. "I just listened." He smiled and nodded. Listening is the beginning of every kind of grace. As autumn approached, Evelyn felt the familiar coolness return to the air. The trees began to turn shades of gold and red, and the scent of wood smoke drifted through the valley. She prepared the house for the coming cold, sealing the windows, stacking firewood, and baking bread. She loved this season most, the quiet of it, the sense of closure it carried. One evening, she received a letter from her son, Thomas. He wrote that he planned to visit for Thanksgiving and bring his family. It would be the first time in years that the house would be filled with voices and laughter again. Evelyn read the letter twice, her hands trembling with joy. When the day finally came, the house was alive in a way she had not known for decades. Her grandchildren ran through the fields, their laughter echoing off the barn walls. Her daughter-in-law helped her in the kitchen, and Thomas fixed the loose hinge on the porch door without her even asking. At the dinner table, surrounded by family, Evelyn bowed her head and gave thanks for everything. The joy, the sorrow, the lessons, the miracles hidden in the ordinary. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, she stepped outside alone. The air was cold and the sky was clear. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the field. She looked toward the well, now surrounded by the flowers she had planted months before. The petals glowed faintly in the silver light. She felt a warmth settle in her chest and whispered, "It's all right now." When she turned back to the house, she saw the candle still burning in the window. Its flame flickered softly, and for a brief second she thought she saw two faint shapes reflected beside it, not ghosts, but memories. Margaret and Henry standing quietly as if keeping watch. Then the wind shifted, and the reflection faded. Evelyn smiled and walked inside. She sat at her writing desk and opened her notebook one last time. Her pen moved slowly but surely across the page. Some stories do not end. They become part of the land. The earth remembers what we forget, and it waits for love to return. I believe that every promise made in faith is kept, even if it takes a lifetime to find its way home. She closed the notebook and placed it beside the photograph and the journal. Outside, the fields lay under a blanket of quiet moonlight. The world was still, but it did not feel empty. It felt full of stories, full of life, full of grace. And as the candle burned lower, Evelyn whispered a prayer of gratitude. She thanked God for second chances, for peace after pain, and for the gift of being the keeper of a story that had finally found its rest. The farmhouse stood calm against the night, its windows glowing softly, like eyes that had finally seen the truth. Inside, peace had made its home. The years that followed moved slowly across the Tennessee Valley, painting each season with patient hands. Time, once sharp and restless, had softened into rhythm. The farmhouse stood firm on the hill, its white paint faded but proud, its windows still glowing at dusk with the same warm light that had guided Evelyn through so many nights. The fields beyond stretched wide and steady, golden in summer, pale and quiet in winter. Life had not grown easier, but it had grown gentler. and that was enough. Evelyn had grown older, though age had settled on her with kindness. Her hair was silver now, her steps slower, yet her eyes carried the same quiet strength that had kept her through loss and discovery. She spent her mornings walking along the fence line, checking the posts and watching the birds sweep low over the grass. Every sound around her, the creak of wood, the distant hum of tractors, the low call of doves, felt like part of a hymn she knew by heart. The townspeople had come to know her as the woman of the old Whitaker house, the one who tended her land with patience and spoke about grace with the calm certainty of someone who had seen its proof. She never told them every detail of the photograph or the voices of the past. Some stories, she believed, were meant to rest quietly in the heart. But when people came to her seeking advice, the young couple struggling to hold on to their faith, the widow learning to live alone, the farmer who feared another hard year, she listened with full attention. And when she spoke, her words carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they were honest. "Peace doesn't arrive in a storm," she often said. "It comes in the quiet after you've chosen to keep believing." Her home became a gathering place for those who sought that quiet. Every Sunday after church, a few neighbors would stop by for coffee or a slice of pie. Children played near the porch while adults sat in rocking chairs, talking about crops, weather, and faith. There was always a candle burning near the window, its soft flame a sign of welcome. People said they felt something different in that house, a stillness that seemed to settle even the busiest heart. One spring afternoon, the local school invited Evelyn to speak to the children about the history of the valley. She accepted, though she felt shy about it. When she stood before the class, the children listened with wide eyes as she spoke about the old farms, the rivers that shaped the land, and the people who had built their lives with little more than faith and steady hands. Before she left, one child raised her hand and asked, "Do you think the past ever leaves us?" Evelyn smiled. "No," she said, "the past doesn't leave. It waits for us to make peace with it." That evening, as she walked home, she thought about that question and how much it meant. The road curved gently toward her farmhouse, the fields glowing in the late afternoon light. She could hear the soft hum of insects in the grass and the slow beat of her own steps on the gravel. For a moment, she imagined all the people who had walked that same road before her, Margaret, Henry, Richard, and countless others whose names had faded, but whose stories had shaped the soil beneath her feet. It gave her comfort to think she was part of that quiet lineage of hearts that had endured. The following Sunday, Pastor Lewis dedicated part of his sermon to her story. He spoke about how faith is not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of courage to look beyond it. He told the congregation how Evelyn had turned loss into light, how she had carried grace not in words, but in deeds. When the service ended, many people came to her pew to shake her hand. She felt humbled, her cheeks warm with gratitude. "I only did what I had to," she said softly. "We all find our own ways to listen when God speaks." That night, after everyone had gone, she sat on her porch and watched the sun melt into the hills. The candle flickered beside her, and the air smelled of honeysuckle and rain. She opened her notebook, the same one she had written in for years, and began a new page. Her handwriting was slower now, the letters looping with age, but her thoughts were clear. She wrote, "The land remembers us not by what we take from it, but by what we leave behind. Kindness, forgiveness, and love are the only things that grow when everything else fades." She closed the notebook and placed it beside the photograph and the journal. Together they formed a quiet archive of lives that had crossed and healed through time. Sometimes when she looked at them, she imagined the stories weaving together like threads in a quilt, each line connected, each color necessary. As autumn returned, the valley turned gold again. The air grew cooler, and the scent of smoke from nearby farms drifted through the hills. Evelyn loved these months most. The light was softer, the days slower. She spent her afternoons canning preserves, sewing new curtains, and sitting by the window as the wind carried dry leaves across the yard. The rhythm of her days was the rhythm of peace itself. No haste, No regret, only gratitude for another sunrise, another quiet evening. One evening, as she prepared tea, she heard a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found a young woman standing there with a basket of flowers. "Mrs. Evelyn," the woman said, "my grandmother asked me to bring these. She said you once helped her when she lost her husband. She wanted you to have these as thanks." Evelyn accepted the flowers with gentle hands. "Tell her she gave me more than she knows," she replied. After the young woman left, Evelyn placed the flowers in a glass jar and set them near the window. Their scent filled the room with sweetness. That night, she lit her candle and prayed, not for herself, but for everyone who still walked through their own dark fields, searching for peace. She prayed they would find it, maybe not soon, but surely, just as she had. The years passed quietly, and Evelyn became something of a legend in town. People began referring to her house as the light on the hill. Travelers passing through often stopped to take photographs of it, drawn by the sight of that single glowing window at night. To some, it was just a farmhouse. To others, it was a reminder that goodness could endure even after generations of hardship. Evelyn never sought the attention, but she was grateful that the story had found its way into the hearts of others. In her later years, her son Thomas visited more often. He brought his wife and children, filling the house with laughter again. Her grandchildren loved hearing stories about the photograph, about the well, and about how the land had once held secrets that turned into blessings. She told the story simply, always ending with the same line: "What matters is not what we find in the dark, but what we choose to do with the light." One winter evening, as snow began to fall softly over the valley, Evelyn sat near the fireplace with her family gathered around. The room glowed in orange light, the air thick with the scent of pine wood and baking bread. Thomas asked her if she ever thought of leaving the farmhouse, perhaps moving closer to town. She shook her head gently. "This house still has things to teach me," she said, "and I still have peace to keep." That night, after everyone went to bed, she stood at the window and watched the snow settle over the fields. The candle flame reflected softly on the glass, and for a moment she felt something familiar in the air, a warmth that didn't come from the fire. It was the same warmth she had felt years ago when the story began, the same quiet assurance that love never truly leaves. She whispered a thank you to the land, to the past, and to the God who had guided her through both. As the years continued their patient march, Evelyn grew frail but never weak. Her hands trembled, but her voice remained sure. She still walked to the porch each morning, even when her steps were small and slow. The view never changed much, the fields, the hills, the endless sky, but every sunrise felt new. She often said that heaven must look a lot like Tennessee in early spring, when the mist lifts and everything shines for a moment before the day begins. And so, in that quiet farmhouse on the hill, Evelyn lived her remaining years surrounded by peace, her faith anchored like the roots of the oaks outside. She had turned sorrow into light, memory into legacy, and a single photograph into a lesson about love that lasts beyond time. The house stood as it always had, patient and kind, its windows glowing in the dusk. For anyone who passed by, it seemed almost alive, a beacon of grace built from the hands of a woman who had learned that redemption does not come all at once. It comes slowly, through days of faith and nights of quiet prayer. And if you looked closely at that farmhouse window as evening fell, you might have seen it too, the faint reflection of a woman with silver hair sitting calmly beside a candle, her eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting not for answers, but for peace. The winter that followed came quietly, the kind of winter that did not arrive with storms or thunder, but with stillness. Snow covered the Tennessee hills in a soft blanket, and the fields that once shimmered in gold now lay silent beneath the pale sky. The air was cold but clean, and when the wind moved, it whispered through the trees like a hymn too old for words. Evelyn felt the weight of the years in her bones, but her spirit remained strong. Her mornings were slower now, her movements deliberate, yet every small task carried a kind of reverence. She had learned that peace was not found in grand gestures, but in the steady rhythm of ordinary grace. Each day she woke before dawn. She would sit by the window, wrapped in a shawl, and watch the horizon fade from darkness into light. Sometimes she prayed aloud, sometimes in silence, always beginning with gratitude. She thanked God for another sunrise, for the warmth of the house, for the small miracles that filled her days, the scent of coffee, the sound of sparrows, the steady flicker of the candle that had burned through years of joy and sorrow. Her son visited often now, making the long drive from the city every weekend. He brought groceries, medicine, and news of his children. They sat together by the fireplace in the evenings, sharing quiet moments that needed no explanation. Sometimes he read aloud from the Bible, and sometimes he simply listened as Evelyn told stories about the land and the people who had lived before them. "This place is full of memory," she said one evening, "but not the kind that keeps you trapped. The kind that reminds you that love outlasts everything else." Outside, snow began to fall again, slow and deliberate. The flakes caught the light from the window and drifted toward the earth like soft ash. The sound of the fire crackling filled the room, and Evelyn closed her eyes, resting her head against the chair. She listened to her son's voice and to the quiet music of the house that had sheltered her through so many seasons. In the following weeks, her strength began to fade, though she did not speak much of it. She still moved through her routines, feeding the cat that slept near the porch, lighting her candle at sunset, writing a few lines each night in her notebook. But she knew the time was drawing near when she would have to leave this life behind. There was no fear in her, only a deep sense of completion, like a story reaching its final page. One morning, Pastor Lewis came to visit. The air was sharp, and his boots left prints in the snow that led straight to her door. She greeted him with her familiar smile and invited him in. They talked for hours, their conversation weaving through memories and scripture, through laughter and silence. Before he left, he took her hand gently. "You've lived your faith well, Evelyn," he said. "You've turned this house into a prayer." She smiled softly. "I only listened," she replied. "The house was praying long before I ever came." That night, after he left, she sat by the fire with her notebook open. The words came easily, steady as her breath. "If love is the seed, then faith is the soil that keeps it alive. The roots go deeper than we can see. Even when the leaves fall, even when the seasons change, the roots remain." She set her pen down and closed the book. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. The next morning was colder. Frost clung to the windows and the sky was a dull grey that promised more snow. Evelyn stayed in bed longer than usual, her body tired but her heart at ease. When she finally rose, she wrapped herself in a blanket and walked slowly to the window. The fields stretched before her, wide and white, untouched by footprints. It looked like the world had been wiped clean. She stood there for a long time, her hands resting on the sill, and whispered a simple prayer of thanks. In the afternoon, Thomas arrived again, carrying wood for the fire and a small box of her favorite tea. She smiled when she saw him. "You shouldn't have driven in this weather," she said. "The snow's not that bad," he replied. They spent the evening together, and when night came, they shared supper at the kitchen table. The candle burned between them, casting soft light on their faces. Evelyn looked at her son and saw the kindness of his father in his eyes. "I want you to keep the house," she said gently. "When I'm gone, promise me you'll keep the light burning." Thomas nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "I promise." That night, after he had gone to bed, Evelyn sat by the fire once more. The house was still, wrapped in the deep quiet of winter. She looked at the photograph on the mantel, now framed in a new glass she had bought the year before. The image had faded even more, but the warmth it carried had not. She thought about all the years that had passed since she first found it, about how it had led her from fear to faith, from sorrow to peace. She whispered, "Thank you for finding me too." The next morning, the sky was clear. The light spilled through the windows, bright and soft. Thomas woke early and went to check on his mother. He found her sitting in her chair by the window, the candle still burning beside her. Her hands rested gently on her lap, and a faint smile lingered on her face. She looked peaceful, like someone who had simply drifted into a deeper kind of sleep. The photograph lay on the table beside her, the pages of her notebook open to the last line she had written the night before. The light will always find its way home. Thomas stood there for a long time, the morning light warming his face. He did not cry at first. He just watched the candle flicker and felt the presence of calm that filled the room. He reached out, closed her notebook carefully, and whispered, "You did it, Mom. You found the light." In the days that followed, the town came together to honor her. The church was filled with people, neighbors, friends, and those she had comforted through the years. Pastor Lewis spoke about her life with quiet reverence. He said she had taught them that faith was not about seeing miracles, but about becoming one. The congregation nodded through their tears, the sound of the old church bell echoing softly across the valley. After the service, Thomas returned to the farmhouse. The candle was still there by the window. Its wick burned low. He lit it again and stood in silence, watching the flame dance. Outside, the wind moved through the fields, and the setting sun turned the snow to gold. He opened her notebook and began to read her words. Each page carried the rhythm of her heart, steady and patient. As he read, he understood that the house was more than wood and stone. It was a vessel of grace, a keeper of stories, a place where time and eternity had touched. That night, Thomas sat by the same window where his mother had spent so many evenings. He looked at the candle's glow reflected in the glass and saw, for just a moment, a faint outline beside it, the shape of a woman sitting calmly, her hands folded, her eyes full of peace. Then it faded into the light. He smiled and whispered, "I see you." The years went on. The fields bloomed again. The seasons turned, and the house remained, its windows still glowing at dusk. People still called it the light on the hill. Travelers said they could see the candle flickering from miles away, a sign of welcome and warmth. Inside, Thomas kept everything as it had been. The photograph, the notebook, the journal, all rested on the mantel, untouched but alive in spirit. Sometimes when storms rolled across the valley, the wind would rattle the windows and carry a sound that felt almost like a voice, soft, steady, full of love. And those who stayed the night swore they could feel peace settle over them like a blanket. The farmhouse endured through time, a living memory of one woman's faith and the quiet miracle of forgiveness. The land around it remained fertile, the trees strong, the soil rich with stories, and every night when the world grew dark, that single candle still burned by the window, a reminder that no matter how deep the shadow, there is always light waiting to be found. The farmhouse remained on the hill long after Evelyn was gone, standing steady against the wind and the slow rhythm of time. Seasons came and went like breaths, brushing the land with color and silence. In spring, the fields turned green again, the wildflowers blooming along the fence she had once repaired. In summer, the air shimmered with heat and the hills rolled endlessly beneath the blue sky. Autumn came with its gold and its slow music of falling leaves, and winter returned each year to remind the land of rest. Through it all, the candle still burned by the window each night, just as she had asked. Thomas kept his promise. Every evening before darkness settled over the valley, he lit the small white candle and placed it on the windowsill. He often stood there for a moment, watching the flame steady itself, remembering how his mother had sat in that very chair, her hands folded, her eyes soft and sure. The house was quiet most nights, but it never felt empty. There was a presence in the air, not something to fear, but something to honor. It felt like peace made visible. Over time, the house became known throughout the county as Evelyn's Light. Travelers passing through the valley often saw the glow from the road and slowed their cars just to look. The locals said the candle had never gone out, even on nights when storms rolled down from the mountains. The wind might howl, the trees might bend, but the light always returned. Some said it was faith itself keeping watch. Others said it was simply love, refusing to fade. Thomas found comfort in those stories. He had inherited not only the house, but the quiet wisdom his mother had lived by. He worked the land with the same patience she had shown, tending the soil as though it were sacred. On Sundays, he brought his children to the small church where Pastor Lewis still preached. The pastor had grown older too, his voice slower, but his faith just as steady. He often spoke of Evelyn, not by name but by lesson. "We all leave light behind," he would say. "Sometimes it takes the shape of kindness, sometimes it takes the shape of courage, and sometimes it's a candle that refuses to go out." After church, the family would visit the cemetery. The graves of Henry Cole and Margaret Whitaker rested under the same tree, the one that bloomed white every spring. Evelyn's headstone stood nearby, carved with the words she had written in her notebook. "The light will always find its way home." The children would lay flowers there, their hands small and careful, their laughter soft as the wind. Thomas would stand beside them, his hat in hand, his heart full. Years passed, and the town around the valley began to change. Roads were paved, new stores were built, and the young began to leave for the cities. But the farmhouse stayed the same. Its white paint chipped and weathered, its porch creaked with age, yet it never lost its warmth. Thomas grew older, his hair graying, his steps slower, but every evening he still lit the candle. Sometimes his daughter Emily would join him. She loved the sound of the match striking, the brief flare of light before the steady glow. "It's beautiful," she would say. "It's more than that," Thomas replied. "It's a promise." Emily grew up hearing her grandmother's story. She had never known Evelyn, but she felt as though she had. Her father's voice carried her presence in every word. On quiet nights, Emily would sit by the window and read her grandmother's notebook, tracing the loops of her handwriting with gentle fingers. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and candle wax. Some passages spoke of sorrow, others of faith, all of them of hope. She read them so often that she began to memorize them. Her favorite line was simple: "Peace is the harvest of a faithful heart." When Emily turned 20, she left for college. But she returned every holiday, drawn back by the sound of the wind through the trees and the golden light over the fields. She told her friends about the house, about the candle, and about the woman who had taught generations what it meant to endure with grace. Some of them came to visit, curious to see the place for themselves. When they asked if the story of the photograph was true, Emily only smiled and said, "The truth is in the light." One autumn evening, long after the first frost, Thomas fell ill. The doctors said his heart was tired, that he should rest. He moved slower now, spending his days on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun cross the valley. Emily cared for him, lighting the candle each night, as he had done for years. Sometimes he would fall asleep in his chair before sunset, and she would see the flame reflected in his glasses. The light seemed to rest on his face like a blessing. One night, as the first snow began to fall, Thomas called Emily to his side. "When I'm gone," he said softly, "keep it burning. Not for me, but for her, and for everyone who ever needs to find their way home." Emily nodded, her throat tight. "I promise," she whispered. He smiled, his eyes calm. That's all she ever wanted. When he passed a few days later, the entire town gathered at the church once again. Pastor Lewis, his voice frail but resolute, spoke of Thomas as he had of Evelyn. "He carried the light forward," he said, "and now it burns in the hearts of those who remain." After the service, Emily returned to the farmhouse. The air was cold, and dusk was falling fast. She walked to the window, struck a match, and lit the candle. The flame rose and steadied, and the reflection in the glass showed her face beside her grandmother's photograph. For a moment, she thought she saw another figure too, a man standing at the edge of the light, smiling with quiet pride. Then it was gone, leaving only the glow. Time continued its patient rhythm. Emily married and had children of her own. She and her husband took care of the farmhouse, repairing what age had worn down, painting the porch, planting new flowers along the fence. Each generation added something of their own, but they never changed what mattered most. The candle still burned each night, the photograph still hung on the wall, the notebook still rested on the mantel, its pages worn from years of touch. As Emily's children grew, they too learned the story. On stormy nights, when the wind howled and thunder rolled across the hills, they would gather by the window and watch the candle flicker. It never went out. Their mother told them that sometimes faith was not about asking for miracles, but about keeping the light steady when the wind rose. The children listened, their eyes wide, the flame reflected in their faces. The story of Evelyn spread beyond the valley. Visitors from nearby towns came to see the farmhouse that had become a living symbol of endurance. Local papers wrote about it, calling it the house that never sleeps. One journalist described it as a beacon of hope in troubled times. Emily never sought attention, but she welcomed those who came with open hearts. She told them what her father had told her. This isn't just a house, it's a prayer made of wood and light. Decades later, when Pastor Lewis passed away, the church held a memorial service. Emily spoke that day. She stood at the same wooden podium where her grandmother had once told her story. "He was the last voice of that generation," she said. "But what he taught us, what they all taught us, doesn't fade. It's alive in every act of kindness, every word of forgiveness, every candle we light against the dark." When she returned home that evening, she stood by the window as her children lit the candle. Outside, the hills glowed beneath the setting sun, and the fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The light flickered once, then steadied. She thought about how many times it had burned, through storms, through winters, through lifetimes. She realized that it was no longer just her family's light. It belonged to everyone who believed that goodness endures. Years later, when Emily grew old, she passed the same promise to her children. The words were simple, the same ones her father had spoken to her. "Keep it burning." And so they did. The farmhouse still stands on that Tennessee hill. The wind still moves through the grass. The trees still bend and sway. And when night falls, a single candle glows in the window. Travelers still slow their cars when they pass, drawn to that soft circle of light. Some say it is the spirit of the widow watching over her land. Others say it is the soul of the valley itself. But those who know the story understand what it truly is, a legacy of faith carried forward by generations who refused to let the light die. And so, in a world that often forgets to be still, Evelyn's candle continues to burn. It burns for love that waited, for truth that endured, and for hope that never left. It burns for every soul who looks into the night and chooses to believe that even in the deepest darkness, light will always find its way home. Decades passed. The Tennessee Valley changed in quiet ways, as time does when it is kind. New roads were built, towns expanded, and the hum of progress reached even the most distant corners of the countryside. But up on the hill, the farmhouse still stood as if time had learned to walk slower there. The paint had worn thin, the shutters hung a little crooked, yet the heart of the place remained untouched. And every evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, a single light glowed in the window, a small candle burning steady against the dark. By then, the story of Evelyn and her light had grown far beyond the valley. People from across the state came to see the house. Some came out of curiosity, others out of quiet need. They said the candle was more than a symbol. It was a reminder that hope could survive anything. Newspapers ran stories about the light on the hill, and photographs of the farmhouse appeared in magazines, the candle's glow shining through the dusk, like a star resting on earth. In the town below, a small museum was opened in honor of the region's history. One corner was dedicated entirely to Evelyn Whitaker and her home. Inside a glass case lay her notebook, carefully preserved, open to the final page where she had written, "The light will always find its way home." Beside it rested the old photograph, the one that had begun everything, faded now, its edges worn, but still powerful. Visitors often stood before it in silence, trying to imagine the woman who had once held it in her hands, trying to feel what she had felt when she first saw what no one else could explain. A plaque on the wall told her story of love, loss, faith, and the simple courage to keep a candle burning. It spoke not of ghosts or mysteries, but of redemption. Beneath her photograph were the words, "In her home, sorrow became peace. In her faith, darkness became light." Outside the museum, school children ran through the yard, laughing and pointing toward the hill where the farmhouse still stood. Teachers told them that sometimes history isn't found in books, but in the quiet places where someone chose kindness over bitterness, forgiveness over fear. They said Evelyn's story was one of those rare ones that didn't just belong to the past. It belonged to everyone still learning how to endure. At the farmhouse, Evelyn's great-granddaughter, Grace, now lived there with her own family. She was a teacher in the town, and every evening she lit the same candle, just as her ancestors had. The tradition had never been broken. Grace had grown up hearing the stories from her mother and grandmother. She had memorized every line of the notebook, every detail of the photograph, every lesson carried by the light. But what she loved most was the feeling that came over the house at night, that deep, quiet peace that seemed to breathe through the walls. One afternoon in early autumn, Grace found herself speaking with a young journalist who had come from Nashville to write a new story about the house. The journalist was polite but skeptical. "Do you really believe," she asked, "that a candle can hold the meaning of a person's life?" Grace smiled gently. "It's not the candle," she said. "It's what it stands for. My great-grandmother didn't light it because she was trying to be remembered. She lit it because she believed no one should have to face the dark alone." The journalist looked around the old living room, taking notes. The light poured in through the window, catching the dust in soft, golden lines. "It's beautiful here," she said quietly. "It feels alive." Grace nodded. "It is," she said, "because faith doesn't die when people do. It lingers in places that were built with love." Later that evening, as the journalist drove away, she looked back once more at the farmhouse. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and there it was, the candle glowing in the window. She felt something stir in her chest, something she couldn't quite explain, a mix of warmth and longing. When she returned to the city, she wrote her article not as a story about an old legend, but as a reflection on what it means to keep believing in something good. The headline read, "The Light That Never Went Out." As the years went on, more visitors came. Some brought flowers, others prayers, and some just quiet hearts needing rest. Grace opened the doors of the farmhouse on weekends for those who wished to see it. She guided them through the rooms, telling them about Evelyn, about the photograph, and about the land that had carried generations of hope. She never dramatized the tale. She spoke simply, letting the stillness of the place tell most of the story. When visitors reached the window, she would pause and say, "That's where it all began, and where it continues." Many left with tears in their eyes. Some left candles of their own, small votives placed gently by the gate, tiny flames joining the great lineage of light. On certain nights, when the valley was still and the moon hung low, it seemed as if the whole hillside shimmered with small lights, each one carrying the echo of Evelyn's promise. In time, the farmhouse was declared a historical landmark. A modest sign was placed at the foot of the hill that read, "Evelyn's Light, a house of faith and memory." The local government offered to install electric lighting to preserve safety, but Grace refused. "The candle has lasted for more than a century," she said. "It doesn't need help to keep burning." One spring morning, Grace found her young son sitting by the window, staring at the candle as it burned. He looked up at her and asked, "Mama, why do we still light it if great-great-grandma's already in heaven?" Grace smiled and knelt beside him. "Because heaven's not far away," she said. "Sometimes it's as close as the light in this room." The boy nodded thoughtfully. He reached out his small hand toward the candle, but didn't touch it. "Do you think she knows we still do it?" Grace looked at the flame for a long time before answering. "Yes," she said softly, "I think she knows." That night, after her family had gone to bed, Grace sat by the same window where Evelyn had once written her last words. The air was warm, the scent of honeysuckle drifting in from the fields. She opened the old notebook and ran her fingers over the faded ink. The pages had grown fragile, but the words still spoke with clarity. She read them slowly, aloud, as if speaking to someone she could not see. "Faith is not what we find when we reach the end. It's what we carry through every step along the way." When she closed the book, the room was silent except for the quiet hum of the night. The candle burned steadily beside her, the flame dancing softly. She thought about all the years that had passed, all the lives that had touched this place, all the moments of grace that had been born from a single act of love. And she realized that what her great-grandmother had created was more than a story. It was a sanctuary for anyone who needed to remember that light never surrenders to darkness. As the clock ticked softly and the night deepened, Grace felt something familiar in the air. It wasn't cold or strange. It was warmth, the kind that fills a room when someone you love walks in. She didn't turn her head or speak. She just sat there, breathing in the peace that surrounded her. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the wind, their leaves whispering the same message the land had carried for generations. In the morning, when the sun rose over the valley, the light spilled through the farmhouse window and touched the old photograph on the wall. The image glowed faintly in the golden light, and for a moment the face in the picture seemed almost alive again, calm, serene, watching over everything it had once known. Grace stood in the doorway, smiling through quiet tears. "Good morning," she whispered. The world beyond the valley moved fast. Machines grew louder, cities brighter, and time less patient. But on that hill under the endless Tennessee sky, one thing never changed. When night came, the farmhouse window glowed. The candle burned as it always had, and those who passed by on the road below still slowed their cars to look up. Some prayed, some smiled, some simply felt comfort without knowing why. Because the story of Evelyn's light was not just about one woman. It was about the faith that moves quietly through generations, about the way love survives in the hands of those willing to keep it alive. It was about a house, a hill, and a flame that refused to fade, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there will always be someone, somewhere, who remembers to light the candle. The 21st century brought many changes to the world beyond the valley. Towns that had once seemed distant were now connected by fast roads and glowing screens. The pace of life grew quicker, the noise louder, and the silence rarer. Yet even as the world hurried forward, the small farmhouse on the hill remained untouched by the rush. It stood quietly as it always had, surrounded by fields that still caught the light of morning and the breath of wind in the afternoons. And each night, when darkness settled across the Tennessee hills, that single candle still burned in the window, its flame steady and sure, the same as it had been for more than 100 years. People came from far and near to see it. They came not as tourists chasing stories, but as souls searching for stillness. The road to the farmhouse had become familiar to many, a narrow lane lined with oaks that seemed to lean inward, their branches forming a quiet tunnel of shade. Those who walked it often spoke in whispers, without knowing why, as if the land itself asked for reverence. When they reached the house, they would stop at the gate and look up. The candle's glow could be seen even in the fading daylight, small yet unwavering, a humble miracle of persistence. Grace's children, now grown, cared for the place together. They tended the garden, painted the fence, and welcomed visitors with gentle smiles. They never charged admission, never sold souvenirs. When people asked why, they always gave the same answer. This house wasn't built for profit, it was built for peace. Inside, the room still held Evelyn's touch. Her Bible rested on the table by the window, open to the Psalms. Her notebook and photograph remained on the mantel. The wooden floors creaked softly, the same way they had when she had walked them in quiet prayer. The scent of beeswax and lavender filled the air. Visitors often said the house felt alive. Some claimed they could feel warmth in the walls, as if the wood remembered every word ever spoken within it. Others said the air carried a faint sound, not a voice, but a hum, like the low harmony of a hymn. Whether true or imagined, it comforted those who came. They said it was as if the house knew who needed healing and offered it in silence. One evening in early spring, a young woman arrived at the farmhouse just as the sun was setting. Her name was Clara. She had driven for hours from another state, following directions she had found online after reading an article about Evelyn's light. Her life had been heavy lately. Her marriage had ended, her father had fallen ill, and she felt as if everything she believed in had begun to unravel. She came not expecting miracles, but needing a moment of quiet, something real that could hold her together. Grace's granddaughter, now the keeper of the house, met her at the gate. She was kind and soft-spoken, much like Evelyn had been described. She led Clara inside and offered her tea. The two women sat near the window as the candle burned between them. Outside, dusk spread slowly across the valley, turning the sky into shades of violet and rose. "It's strange," Clara said after a long silence. "The world feels so loud now. I forgot what peace sounds like." The younger woman smiled. "Peace still has a voice," she said. "You just have to listen long enough to hear it." They spoke for hours, not about religion or history, but about life, about heartbreak, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. When it grew late, Clara thanked her host and stood to leave. Before she walked out, she looked at the candle and whispered, "I think I understand now." The woman nodded. "Then take the light with you," she said. "It never runs out." A month later, Clara sent a letter. She wrote that her visit had changed her life. She had returned home and made peace with her father before he passed away. She had begun volunteering at her local church, helping others find hope again. She said that every night she lit a candle in her window, just like Evelyn's. "I don't know if anyone else sees it," she wrote, "but I know it reminds me that love doesn't disappear. It waits." That letter became one of many. Over the years, hundreds of people wrote to the family, sharing their stories. Some had visited the house, others had simply read about it or seen a photograph online. A woman from Kansas said she lit a candle every night for her son serving overseas. A man from Maine wrote that after visiting the farmhouse, he had found the strength to forgive his brother after 20 years. A single mother from Texas said the light gave her courage to keep going when she felt alone. Each story different, yet all bound by the same thread, the belief that faith, however small, could still guide a person through the dark. The family began keeping the letters in a wooden chest that sat near the fireplace. The chest grew full over time until it became as much a part of the house as the old photograph. Grace's great-grandchildren would sometimes sit on the floor, reading the letters aloud to one another. They would laugh, cry, and fall silent, realizing that their great-great-grandmother's story had become part of thousands of other lives. "She's still working," one of the children said once, "even from heaven." On the 100th anniversary of Evelyn's passing, the town held a gathering at the farmhouse. It was a mild autumn evening, and the air smelled of apples and wood smoke. People came from near and far, church members, farmers, travelers, and families who had carried the story in their hearts. The mayor gave a small speech, though his words were simple. "This light," he said, pointing toward the glowing window, "belongs to all of us now." A local choir sang Amazing Grace, their voices rising softly over the fields. As the last note faded, the crowd fell silent, watching the candle flicker in the window bright against the dusk. That night, when everyone had gone home, Grace's youngest descendant, a girl named Lily, stood by the window, holding a fresh candle in her hands. She was only 12 years old, curious and thoughtful. Her mother watched as she struck a match and lit the flame. The girl whispered, "Do you think she can see it?" Her mother smiled, brushing her hair from her face. "I think she sees every light we keep alive." The world outside kept changing. Faster cars, brighter cities, louder voices. But people still came to that quiet Tennessee hill. Some brought their children, others came alone. Some stayed only a few minutes, others spent hours in silence. No one left unchanged. They said it wasn't just the candle that mattered. It was the feeling, the weight of love that still lived in that old wooden house, the echo of prayers whispered over a century. In a way, Evelyn had become part of something larger than herself. Her life had stretched beyond time, beyond generations. She had turned a moment of sorrow into a lifetime of grace. The farmhouse had become a bridge between past and present, a place where strangers found belonging, where hearts remembered how to hope. On clear nights, when the moon hung high over the valley, the candle's reflection shimmered in the window glass, and from a distance it looked like a small star had settled on Earth. Truck drivers who passed along the highway often spoke of seeing it, a single warm light in the darkness. Some said it made them pull over just to sit in silence for a while. Others said it reminded them of home. In a world where so much was lost to noise and haste, that single steady flame continued to teach a lesson as old as faith itself, that goodness does not need to be loud to be powerful, and that the smallest act of love can outlive even time. And so the light remained. Through rain and wind, through seasons and years, it burned without failing. The house aged, the land changed, but the flame endured, alive in every person who had ever seen it or heard its story. Because in the end, Evelyn's legacy was not a legend. It was a truth. that no matter how far we go or how much the world changes, we are all drawn to the same simple thing, a light that reminds us we are never truly alone. The candle still burned. Through storms and summers, through silence and prayer, it had never gone out. The farmhouse stood firm on the Tennessee hill, the same way it had when Evelyn first held that old photograph in her trembling hands. The boards had darkened with age, and ivy climbed the porch posts, but the house carried its years with grace. It was no longer just a home. It had become a living soul, breathing with the memories of all those who had come seeking comfort. In the quiet hours before dawn, the light glowed faintly against the horizon, the single flame marking the spot where generations of hearts had found peace. Birds stirred in the trees, and the wind carried the faint scent of cedar and rain. If one stood on the road below, it was easy to believe the house was praying, not with words, but with light. Inside, the rooms were filled with soft warmth. The walls, once plain, were now lined with framed letters from people who had written to the family over the years. Some were yellowed and torn, others printed from emails sent by strangers from faraway places. Together, they told one story, the story of how one woman's faith had reached across a century to touch lives she could never have imagined. A small plaque rested above the fireplace. It read simply, Evelyn Whitaker, 1882-1945. Her light still burns. Every year on the anniversary of her passing, people gathered at the farmhouse. They came carrying candles, flashlights, lanterns, and even cell phone screens lit with a quiet glow. At sunset, when the valley turned golden and shadows grew long, they formed a line stretching down the hill. Hundreds of lights flickered in unison, their glow joining the steady flame in the farmhouse window. The air would fill with music, soft hymns sung by the local choir. The words of Amazing Grace drifted over the fields, the same melody Evelyn herself had once hummed when she prayed alone in the dark. Among the crowd were children who had grown up hearing the story, elderly couples holding hands, and travelers who had driven hundreds of miles just to stand in that quiet field. They said the same thing every year, that they felt something they couldn't explain. Some called it peace, some called it grace, others simply said it felt like coming home. As the night deepened, the sky turned to velvet. The stars came out one by one, scattered like seeds across the heavens. The candle still burned in the window, steady as a heartbeat. And if you listened closely, you could almost hear the echo of Evelyn's voice in the wind, calm, gentle, filled with the certainty that love never disappears. The farmhouse had outlived everyone who had built or rebuilt it, yet its story remained alive through those who kept returning. Each visitor left something behind, a tear, a prayer, a promise whispered into the air. And in return they carried something away, something invisible but lasting. The light didn't just stay in the house anymore, it traveled in them, following them back into their own lives, their own valleys and storms. Grace's great-granddaughter Lily had now become the caretaker. She was a woman in her 30s, with eyes the same shade of blue as the morning sky, and hands that carried both strength and gentleness. She worked as a counselor at a nearby hospital, helping people find their way through grief and pain. When asked what inspired her, she always said, "I come from a house that learned how to turn sorrow into light." Each morning before work, she lit the candle the same way her ancestors had done. Each evening, when she returned home, she sat by the window with a notebook in her lap, just as Evelyn once had. Sometimes she wrote her own reflections. Sometimes she copied lines from the old notebook that still rested on the mantel. Her favorite was one she had memorized since childhood. Faith is not the fire. It is the hand that keeps the flame steady when the wind blows. One winter evening, Lily received a message from a man named Robert, who lived across the country. He had read about the farmhouse and wanted to visit. His wife had recently passed away, and he said he couldn't find peace. "I'm not sure why," he wrote, "but I feel like I need to see that light for myself." Lily welcomed him warmly. When Robert arrived a week later, the valley was covered in snow. The air was crisp and still, the sky a deep silver, Lily met him at the gate, offered him a blanket and a seat by the fire. For a long time, they didn't speak. He stared at the candle burning by the window, the flame trembling slightly in the draught. Finally, he said, "It's smaller than I imagined." Lily smiled. Most miracles are. That night, he sat in silence while she read aloud from Evelyn's notebook. When she finished, Robert leaned forward, his eyes wet. "I think I understand now," he said. "It's not about the light in the window. It's about keeping one inside." Lily nodded. That's what she wanted the world to remember. The next morning, when he left, Robert lit a small candle from the flame in the window and carried it carefully in a glass jar. "For my wife," he said quietly, "and for all the nights I thought were empty." Lily watched him drive down the road until his car disappeared into the mist. She knew that somewhere, miles away, another window would soon glow against the dark. Years later, people began calling those lights Evelyn's candles. Photos of them appeared on social media, candles burning in apartments, dorm rooms, hospitals, and churches around the world. Each one carried a story. Each one was a spark from the same flame that had once burned in a lonely farmhouse more than a century ago. Even as the world grew brighter with artificial lights, that simple candle continued to mean something different. It wasn't about brightness, it was about steadiness. It was about the kind of light that doesn't blind but heals. One summer evening, Lily stood outside as the sun went down, the fields glowing amber beneath the sky. She thought about how much had changed since Evelyn's time, the cars, the technology, the endless speed of modern life. But then she looked at the candle in the window and realized that the most important things had never changed at all. People still needed faith. They still needed forgiveness. They still needed light. That night, she wrote new words in the notebook, the first in nearly a decade. "We do not inherit the world from those before us. We inherit their hope, and the best way to honor it is to keep it burning." When she finished writing, she closed the notebook gently and set it back in its place beside the photograph. She looked at Evelyn's face in the faded image and whispered, "It's still here. Everything you left, it's still here." Outside, the moon rose above the hills, silver and full. The candle's flame flickered once, then steadied again. Somewhere beyond the stars, maybe Evelyn smiled, knowing that her light had never truly belonged to her alone. As the night deepened, the wind brushed softly against the windows, carrying the same quiet hymn that had followed her through every generation. The words no one could hear but everyone could feel: faith, forgiveness, love, and home. And so the light remained, in the farmhouse and in the hearts of all who believed. A simple flame in a quiet place, whispering the same truth through every passing year, that no act of kindness is ever lost, and no life lived in faith is ever forgotten.